Salam alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. Today, we begin a new mini-series, revisiting the First Intermediate Period. This is the era between 2200 and 2000 BCE, when, politically, the old pharaonic state temporarily broke down. It is a complicated and messy time, but also an incredibly vibrant one, full of exciting stories from ordinary people. I covered the First Intermediate Period way back in 2014, and a lot has changed since then. The podcast is different, with bigger goals and ambitions. I am a better researcher, and hopefully a better writer. And most importantly, scholars have published a lot of new material in that time. Some stories are quite different from when I first explored this period. Now, 10 years later, I would like to start revisiting it. In this mini-series, we are going to focus on one major theme: warfare. The First Intermediate Period is rife with stories, images, and traces of ancient battles. Some of these were small, skirmishes between petty chieftains. Others were huge, devastating sieges and the destruction of sacred sites. If you are interested in ancient conflict, the First Intermediate Period is a rich subject for study. This episode is part 1, Before the Fall. We begin our tale during the later years of the Old Kingdom, around 2600 to 2200 BCE. I want to introduce the Egyptian army, quote-unquote, during that era, firstly because I only covered it briefly back in 2014, and also because we must. The military traditions, knowledge, skills, and technology that emerged during the Old Kingdom helped define and shape the conflicts of the First Intermediate Period. So to understand what happened then, we need to establish what came before. Plus, to be completely honest, I went down a rabbit hole on the research, and I want to share that with you. Now then, without further ado, welcome to the world of warfare during the Old Kingdom. Our story begins around 2600 BCE, approximately. In this period, the Fourth Dynasty, the ancient Egyptian state leaves relatively few references for large-scale war and battle. We have plenty of images that show the king conquering his enemies, smiting them with great ferocity. But in terms of battles, armies, we don't have the large, elaborate scenes that we find in the New Kingdom, the days of Ramesses II and all that. Instead, historians have to reconstruct Old Kingdom warfare from a variety of sources. The first and most straightforward are the texts. Within the very fragmentary traces of royal activity, we do have a few references to campaigns or raids. The best example comes from the reign of Sneferu, around 2600 BCE, give or take. A royal text from slightly later describes events in the reign of Sneferu, and this included an enormous raid to the south. In one section of this text, Sneferu and his followers, quote, hack up the Nubians, bringing back 7,000 captives and 200,000 cattle and herds, end quote. It sounds like a large, well-organized raid, a journey into the southern lands to plunder their wealth and their people, and to bring them back to Egypt. The goal of this raid was very clearly economic, for in the next section of the text, we get a reference to Sneferu, quote, setting up 35 farming estates with people and 122 cattle farms or ranches, end quote. In other words, King Sneferu sent his warriors south to take captives, both human and animal, and bring them back so that they could work and serve his house. Subsequently, records from the same general period describe high-ranking officials doing the exact same thing. In one text, an Egyptian governor named Ka-em-heset went south with his troops to enact violence. Ka-em-heset described it as, quote, the governor of the 16th district of southern Egypt, Ka-em-heset, came to Nubia with an expedition of 20,000 men to hack up Wawat, that is, northern Nubia." End quote. Subsequently, another governor named Zau'ib went south and, quote, 17,000 Nubians were taken. End quote. These two texts do not have specific dates. We do not know what reign they occurred in, and they might be greatly exaggerated in terms of the number of men involved or the number of captives taken. But the larger point is that ancient Egyptian rulers, both the kings and their subordinates, would frequently go south into the lands we call Nubia in order to raid, destroy, and plunder. We hear about similar events in the west and the east. Kings like Khufu would leave records in the Sinai Peninsula, which show the king smiting his enemies, the local Bedouin, in order to protect the copper and turquoise mines and to ensure Egyptian supremacy. But these references, both texts and art, are noteworthy for not really being battles. They describe raids or punitive measures, and they show the king smiting his foes. But all of that is basically a triumph. There is no detail about conflict or the locals fighting back. This is a problem generally with the 4th Dynasty and the earlier periods. The art and the texts are explicitly focused on victory, displays of power and strength, at which no foreigner could possibly resist. As a result, it can be difficult for historians to reconstruct the ancient Egyptian army, quote-unquote, and the activities of the rulers. That being said, if you know where to look, you can find greater hints of the Egyptian armed forces, both their equipment and their activities. Surprisingly, the best sources are the pyramids. Today, if you visit the pyramid complexes at Giza, Saqqara, or Abu Sir, you will see the monuments themselves, and you will see sections of the larger structures, the temples and the causeways that once filled out the pyramid complex. Unfortunately, most of those structures have been destroyed by time, as blocks were taken away one by one for local use, but archaeological work on the pyramids continues to this day, especially in those larger surrounding areas, and experts have uncovered many fragments of the ancient decoration. This includes military imagery. The Pyramid of Khufu at Giza once had an incredibly long, decorated causeway, a sort of covered road that connected the main temple and the pyramid to the lower temple and the Nile Valley. Like most causeways, it is almost entirely gone, swallowed up by the encroaching suburbs of Cairo. But fortunately, around 4,000 years ago, an Egyptian king stole some of the blocks from Khufu's pyramid causeway and used them to decorate their own pyramid complex. Now, archaeologists have recovered those blocks from the later pyramid and studied the fragments to piece together ancient scenes and imagery. Among these blocks from Khufu's pyramid, there is a slab of limestone that shows a group of Egyptian archers. 4 of these men total are standing, and one of them is kneeling in front of the other. They carry long bows which extend above their heads, and they reach out with one hand to draw the string of the bow towards the middle of their arm length. The archers have short hair cut close to the head, and across their chest they have white bands, which might be linen or leather, a kind of body armor. These white bands are very distinctive to archers, and we'll see them repeatedly in the following descriptions. The archers are looking to their left. Presumably, they are aiming their arrows at some enemy whose image no longer survives. The men use their draw hand to hold the arrow and aim it carefully along the length. They use that same hand to clutch a bundle of arrows, extra ammunition for the forthcoming volleys. Apparently, this scene originally showed a small battalion of archers preparing to loose their arrows at some unseen enemy. Unfortunately, this small fragment is the only one that survives with a military subject matter. But from that tiny trace, we can get a hint that originally, the Great Pyramid Complex of Khufu had an elaborate military decoration in at least one section. Our next piece of evidence comes approximately 100 years after Khufu. From the pyramid complex of Sahura, or Sahure, at Abu Sir, additional blocks have been recovered from the pyramid causeway. Again, they show military subject matter. In this case, the Pyramid of Sahure had a decoration of soldiers training at various military arts. There are 3 scenes in total. In the first one, we see archers training with the bow. They stand with their legs braced apart, and they hold their bows out in front of them. They draw an arrow to the middle of their arm, and they clutch an additional set of arrows in their draw hand. Behind each archer, a trainer, or sebai, stands and gives instructions. There are even hieroglyph captions to convey what the trainer is saying. They say things like, "The captain instructs, do not loosen your arm, and pull the string to the middle of your arm." Within this tableau, we see the results of the instructions. One archer has fired 3 arrows, but none of them have pierced his target, and one of them has actually broken due to his poor technique. But in the second image, there are 2 arrows, and one of them has gone through the target cleanly. The archer is making progress. Finally, in the third image, there are 3 arrows in the target, and at least 2, maybe all of them, have pierced. The scene gives a wonderful glimpse at the specialized training of a particular skill. Unfortunately, we are missing chunks of the larger context, but what we have is an excellent vignette. The second image shows men training with sticks. They are enacting a sort of practice duel. The instructor shows the trainee how to hold his weapon properly, which poses he should strike, and which direction he should move when he is attacking a foe. Again, there are hieroglyph captions that say things like, "Turn to your left side, start from the first again, and strike against the flesh." There are even hints of a dialogue. A couple of hieroglyph captions seem to be the trainee responding to his instructor, saying things like, "Come on, fight! I have started already." Like the archer scene before it, we are missing a large chunk, but the warriors' poses are dynamic, and there's a reasonable chance they reflect the genuine movements that soldiers might practice when training with a stick weapon. Again, it's a really cool scene. Before we move on, I would like to mention one thing. The image of stick fighting from Sahura's pyramid does not have a name, the hieroglyphs are lost. But in the modern world, this would probably be called tatib. Tatib is a sport still practiced in Egypt. It involves the use of sticks, or asaya, about 1.2 meters long, 4 feet, and the combatants face off in pairs in a ceremonial duel. There is musical accompaniment on drums and reed instruments, and the duel itself has a noticeable rhythm. The combatants will swing between slower, stylized movements, displaying the techniques, with sudden bursts of lightning-fast strikes. Today, the art of tatib is strongly associated with southern Egypt, and in particular the Sayyidi or rural farming communities. But its roots go way back into the pharaonic past, and it continues to evolve. In 2016, tatib was added to the UNESCO representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And since 2017, tatib has its own tournaments and martial art organization, with hopes to gain Olympic recognition in the coming decade. So, if you are interested in a ritualized duel, this might be a sport for you. The scene from Sahura's pyramid probably shows the original form of this sport, a training regimen designed to teach the art of mid-range melee, but 4,500 years later, the techniques are still practiced. Finally, we have a more classic image, a scene of warriors or recruits practicing their wrestling. The men pair up against one another, and they display a variety of grapples, holds, and even throws. In one image, a man seems to have grappled his opponent by the leg and is lifting him up, but the opponent is fighting back and wraps his arms around the attacker's head, attempting to lock him. In another scene, one man attempts to pin his opponent to the ground, while that opponent apparently twists, trying to get the attacker underneath him. Finally, we have an image of what can only be described as a suplex, as one warrior seems to bodily throw his opponent over his shoulder. These are the sorts of images that you'll find on 1,000 Greek vases, but they appear here around 2,500 BCE. The hieroglyphs don't tell us the exact movements they are doing, but they do give a little bit of context. One caption says that the men are wrestling on an arena of sand, apparently a set of prepared ground specifically for the purpose. Another caption describes who the combatants actually are. It says that they are wrestling in public with the workers by the warrior crew called the Companions of Sahura, end quote. So apparently a specific military or labor battalion are practicing their wrestling with another group of workers. These scenes from the Temple of Sahura are not widely known outside of Egyptology, but they are fascinating and full of vibrant detail. They also give us an idea of the practical elements of military training. We see them learning the skills of long range with the bow, medium range melee with stick weapons, and the short range, the up-close and personal grappling. We'll come back to training scenes in a couple of episodes, because during the first intermediate period, we get a whole bunch more of these sorts of images, and I can go a bit deeper into the techniques that are displayed. But from the pyramid complex of Sahura around 2500 BCE, these wonderful images give a hint at a sophisticated set of military training practices. So, we know a bit about the training. What about the organization? How did the Old Kingdom Egyptians describe their warriors? And what about their equipment, the weapons and armor they carried into battle? Let's explore those now. When we look at the Old Kingdom overall, there is very little evidence for a professional or standing army. Most of the references that we have suggest that the Egyptian state gathered or recruited troops when they needed them for a particular expedition, raid, or campaign. That doesn't mean there was no concept of a soldier, or different types of warriors who might fill certain needs. The most common word for an Egyptian warrior at this time is mesha, or mesha'u in the plural. That can be used for warriors generally, but it can also be used for laborers, people involved in work and building projects. There seems to be an overlap between the two concepts, at least as far as the Egyptian writers are describing them. There is also reference to the nefer or neferu, the recruits or conscripts, or maybe the youths. These might be warriors called up for a specific occasion, kind of a levy en masse when the ruler needed them. They might also be a reference to young men who are going into a military life more generally, but unfortunately the surviving evidence does not give us any specificity. Then there is the most generic word for a fighter, which is aha. This word can also apply to weaponry and arrows specifically. It's one of the oldest words we have for an Egyptian fighter. In fact, one of the first kings of a unified Egypt was called the Horus Aha, or Horus the warrior. Those are the main terms for the warriors themselves. We have a little bit more detail when it comes to the commanders. Because most of our texts or images come from tombs built by wealthy individuals, we are more likely to hear about the overseer of a particular type of soldier or military group than we are the soldiers themselves. That's an unfortunate reality of the social hierarchy which the Egyptians used, but it does provide some valuable information. The most common title is Imira Mesha, or overseer of troops or laborers. There is also the Imira Au, or Imira Iau, which might reference something like the overseer of troops of foreign origin, or overseer of auxiliaries or mercenaries. That is a really tricky term to decipher, and I won't explore it in this episode. But the idea of foreign troops, different from Egyptians and recruited for a specific purpose, that does show up during the Old Kingdom. Again, we will come back to them further down the line. We also have a sense of the overall organization of the men. There is a title which goes something like Zecha Mesha or Sesh Mesha. This is the scribe of the troops, or maybe the scribe of the army. The fact that this title exists, the fact that there is a scribe for organizing a body of men, gives a hint that they are categorizing them in a specific way. Even if we don't have the details of that organization, there is a hint of some kind of military bureaucracy. That goes further with a title like Imira Achau, which is overseer of the weapons. This can be used to refer to the equipment generally, the official within the battalion or regiment who is responsible for overseeing the weapons and equipment. That may not seem remarkable. If you are gathering a body of armed men, there may be a certain logic to designating one person as being particularly responsible for ensuring the weapons are ready. But beyond that lower personal level of the word, we do get hints of a larger weapons institution. Some individuals are described as the Imira Perwi Achau, that is, the overseer of the 2 houses of weapons. That gives an idea that at least 2 places in the country have special military warehouses or storage facilities, probably for the more expensive, high-quality weapons. Again, we're missing a frustrating amount of detail, but the existence of this title, a reference to an overseer of weapons and an overseer of a house of weapons, suggests that, at least at a basic level, there is an organization of military equipment, which might be dispensed at need. Finally, we have the title Imira Menenu, which is the Overseer of Fortresses. There aren't many examples of Old Kingdom fortresses or fortified spaces. We have occasional references to them in texts, like the city of Memphis, which supposedly had a great white wall, Ineb Hedj, and some of the frontier towns, like out in the western desert and the oases. Those also have hints of watchtowers, outposts, and fortifications in certain areas. A title like Imira Menenu or Imira Menenu Nesu, overseer of the king's fortresses, gives us a hint at a far-reaching military network. How permanent these fortifications were, how long-serving the soldiers within them, all of that remains unknown, but the mere existence of these titles leaves a tantalizing trace of much larger things. We will meet an overseer of the fortresses in just a moment, because one of those individuals has left a fabulous record of ancient Egyptian battles and even the siege of fortified towns. So we'll come back to these Imira Menenu. Unfortunately, references like these, the common words for soldiers, and some of the more common titles for overseers, are some of the best sources we have for written descriptions of the army. It's nothing like we get in the New Kingdom, with the enormous battle scenes and extended descriptions. It's not even much to compare with the Middle Kingdom, where we have the fortresses in the south and the written records that describe life and service in those institutions. So much has vanished from the Old Kingdom that we only have a shadowy picture of their armed forces. The best we can say is that, overall, the soldiers themselves appear to be a levy or a regular conscription, rather than a standing army. That being said, there are references to military institutions, like arsenals and fortresses, so there must be at least some individuals who are working in this field full-time. To say more, we're going to need a lot more future research and excavation. Maybe, if we're lucky, somebody will find a tomb belonging to a high-ranking military official who'll include a nice elaborate description of his duties. For now, in the absence of that, this is the best we can say about the army, quote-unquote, during this period. In terms of weaponry, we don't have many physical examples from the Old Kingdom. Most of this material was probably reused in intervening centuries, especially the items made of copper. But a few of them do survive, and we can get hints. We know that the average Egyptian soldier, the infantryman, could carry a variety of weapons. This would include a spear, made of wood, with a stone or copper head, axes, made of wood, with a sharpened copper blade, bows, which were the self or simple style of bow, rather than the composite which came later, and arrows, usually made of wood or reeds, with a sharpened tip or perhaps a stone or metal arrowhead. Only a few of these items survive which can be definitively dated to the Old Kingdom. They generally include the metal axes or the wooden bows. You can find some of these in various museum collections, and I'll put links to them in the episode description. So the average soldier carried a bunch of melee weapons like axes and spears, but also the long-range weapon, the bow and arrow. There is also the mace, a stone head attached to a wooden handle. The most common type of Egyptian mace is a pear or oval-shaped club. This appears frequently in the art, but we also have physical examples from the early periods. One noteworthy piece is in the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada. It is a limestone club head, and it's inscribed with the royal names of King Khafra, the king who commissioned the second of the Great Giza Pyramids. It's a heavy-duty mace. If somebody swung it with enough force, it would cause quite significant damage. And this is the classic style of royal weapon that we find in the smiting scenes, when a king will grab his enemies by the hair, force them to the ground, and raise his weapon to strike. That motif appears repeatedly in the art, but we do have physical examples of that style of mace. Those are the weapons overall. We do not have many physical examples, just a few here and there, and we get most of our information from the art which appears in tombs. I'll describe some of that later in this episode, and I'll also come back to weapons further on in the First Intermediate period proper. From that time, there are many more weapons with a securely datable origin, so in the centuries following the Old Kingdom, we do have a lot more physical examples of ancient Egyptian weapons. Again, let's put an arrow in that topic, and we'll come back to it soon. The Egyptian army was probably a seasonal, ad hoc affair. Soldiers called up when needed and sent out on expeditions. There was training, but we don't know how widespread that was. Did it apply to all warriors, or just the select few, perhaps those chosen for service in the king's retinue? Unfortunately, on the current evidence, we can only speculate. But enough about their background. Let's get to the action. The artistic scenes of battle where Egyptian soldiers actually go into combat. We have a surprisingly decent corpus of these images for the Old Kingdom. We'll start with another pyramid. Around 2350 BCE, over a century after Khufu, a king named Unas built his royal tomb at the necropolis of Saqqara. We visited this pyramid recently to explore the elaborate pyramid texts. Well, Unas has a bit more information to give us. In the 1930s, an Egyptian archaeologist named Salim Hassan was leading an excavation at the pyramid of Unas, and they found a block with a most interesting scene. This slab of stone preserves two images of a battle. They appear one after the other in horizontal lines or registers. On the top layer, we are in the midst of a field battle. The dominant figure is an archer who is facing to the left. He is striding forward, perhaps bracing his foot, and he reaches out to draw his bow to the middle of his arm length. Like the archers of Khufu, he has close-cropped hair, white bands crossing his chest, and he clutches additional arrows with his draw hand, ready for the next volley. The archer's target is just to the left of him, where we see an enemy of a generic Eastern type. He has long hair with a white band tied around his forehead, and he seems to have a short beard. It is a stereotypical depiction of the Bedouin of the Sinai or the people of southern Canaan. We can't identify them any more specifically. What's interesting about this Easterner is his position. He is not standing facing the archer. Instead, he is inverted, sort of tumbling over backwards and facing away. If you were reading it like a comic book, it almost looks like the archer has fired his arrow with such velocity that it's thrown his enemy backwards, tumbling head over heels. It's possible that that is the intent, but the enemy doesn't have any arrows sticking out of his body, so we can only guess. More likely, there was originally another figure to the left, who is now lost, who was grabbing the enemy by his leg and throwing him over in a sort of wrestling suplex move. Then, perhaps the archer is following up this strike with his own arrow, shooting the enemy as he tumbles head over heels. It's a really dynamic and exciting scene. Just to the right of the archer, we see an image of the melee. This one includes three figures. On the left, there is an Egyptian warrior who is striding forward and attacking aggressively. He is reaching out to grab the arm of an Easterner who is bending backwards as if utterly overwhelmed by the Egyptian's attack. The Egyptian himself holds a dagger or a sword, which he plunges into the shoulder or chest of his enemy. The two are in an interesting pose. The Egyptian on the left is striding forward aggressively, and one of his feet is raised to step on the enemy's knee. It almost looks like he has kicked out at the enemy's thigh, perhaps disabling him or driving him to the ground, before he reaches out with his dagger to strike hard and true. Again, it's an incredibly dynamic scene, full of movement, and presumably when the paint still survived, it would have been full of bright colours, the browns and reds of the Egyptians, the pale yellows of the Easterners, the white of the kilts, the black of the hair, and maybe the splash of blood. The second scene just below is not as well preserved. We do see another archer who this time is striding towards the right and drawing another arrow to shoot an Easterner who is tumbling backwards. On the left, we see an Egyptian soldier marching forward, grabbing his enemy by one hand and raising a weapon to strike. Unfortunately, the block is badly damaged at the top and the bottom, so we are missing a large chunk of the scene. But again, it seems to show a dynamic, exciting melee as the Egyptian warriors, infantry and archers, surge forward into their foes, driving them down with physical combat and with arrows. The battle scenes of Unas are the earliest surviving royal imagery for an ancient Egyptian battle. We do have earlier scenes of conflict from different periods, but these tend to be more ceremonial, smiting scenes, or elaborate images of animals fighting one another, in a sort of metaphor for human conflict. At the time I'm writing, the battle scene of Unas is the earliest surviving scene of an out-and-out melee that we get from a royal complex. Chances are this is not the earliest scene that was ever made, but it is the earliest that still survives. Hopefully, future excavations will give us more evidence. But for now, we have to shout out our main man Unas for once again bringing to life certain aspects of the Old Kingdom society. The Pyramid of Unas is the gift that keeps on giving. Those are the battle scenes from royal monuments. Not much to go on, just the Pyramid of Unas. But it's a start, and it gives us a glimpse. Surprisingly, we actually have better artistic scenes for battle from the tombs of non-royal individuals. I would like to introduce two monuments. They are both tombs belonging to high-ranking officials of the late 5th or early 6th dynasties, around 2350 to 2250 BCE. In this 100-year period, the power and influence of officials grew massively compared to earlier generations. Their monuments started to grow larger, and the decoration of those monuments became more elaborate, with a larger variety of scenes and imagery. From two of these monuments, we get amazing records of Old Kingdom battle. The first tomb belongs to a man named Ka-em-heset, or Ka-em-heset, depending on the source. He lived in the early 6th dynasty, around 2300 BCE, approximately. Like many of his contemporaries, Ka-em-heset built a tomb in the cemetery of Saqqara. He built it in the northern region, near the pyramid of Teti. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Ka-em-heset decorated his tomb with a scene of an ancient battle. Not just any battle, but a siege. On one wall of his tomb, Ka-em-heset showed an Egyptian army attacking a town. The town is depicted as a simple rectangle with curved corners at the top. Inside, it is divided into 4 layers or registers, in which different events and moments unfold. Outside the town, an Egyptian army has gathered. We see them in the moment of the assault. A group of Egyptian soldiers with the classic reddish-brown skin and black, short-cut hair of the Old Kingdom have gathered to make an attempt on the enemy fortifications. They are doing this in 2 ways. First, a couple of men at the bottom are holding long sticks or poles, and they seem to be driving them towards the wall of the enemy town. On the top, we also see a man carrying a hoe, a wooden farming implement called a mer in Egyptian. He seems to be using that hoe to pick at the walls of the town, perhaps trying to hack away at the bricks or the joins and force a breach in the enemy fortification. This kind of sapping, the physical assault of the wall itself, will appear frequently in other scenes, and we get a nice depiction of it here. The main focus of the Egyptian assault is not the sapping though. Instead, it is a ladder. The troops have brought a tall wooden ladder with which to assault the walls. The ladder has wheels at the bottom, with a nice little axle sticking between them. The ladder seems to be oriented forward on the axle, as if they are wheeling it up to the wall and then tilting it forward to provide greater stability. I imagine that if you put it out horizontal, it would almost be like a wheelbarrow, and it's easy to imagine the soldiers rushing towards the wall, dodging arrows in a sort of Benny Hill style. At any rate, Ka-em-heset, or his artist, shows the ladder vertical against the wall, and the Egyptian soldiers are clambering up it, with axes clutched in hand. One man at the top seems to be bracing himself between two rungs of the ladder and the wall itself, and he reaches out with his axe to hack away at the bricks of the fortification. Another man further down is kind of hanging off the side, climbing up with one foot on one rung and his other leg extending backward. He is using both hands to climb, but he has tied his axe into the back of his kilt, where it kind of sticks out like a tail. Lower down, we see another man hanging off the ladder and looking backwards behind him at one of the sapper men. Perhaps he is shouting out encouragement or warnings to his comrades, or perhaps he is getting a last look at the army behind him as he prepares to climb up. Like the scene of Unas before, it is full of energy and movement as the soldiers scramble up the ladder, attack the walls, and prepare to make their breach. Presumably, once they do, it will be terrible news for the people inside. Speaking of the people, the inside of the town is depicted in quite nice detail. Again, it is divided into 4 layers or registers. At the top, we see a local apparently hurling a spear or stones, presumably fighting back against the Egyptian attackers. Another man is lying on the ground. It's possible he's wounded, but he may also be putting his ear close to the walls, listening for the sound of the Egyptian axes. Perhaps he is trying to find the spot which they are actually attacking, so that the locals can reinforce that should the enemy break through. It's a lively motif that we'll see repeatedly. Just below them, in the 3rd register, we see the locals gathering up their cattle. They have brought their livestock within the town, and they seem to be ushering them towards a hill or a cave to wait out the siege. In the bottom register, at the ground, we see women and children. One of them has her hands over her heart, as if she is praying for safety, or perhaps calling out to a deity or her comrades. The latter might be more likely, because just to the right of this woman, we see another couple of men listening for the sounds of the Egyptian breach. These 2 men are kneeling on the ground, just on the other side of the wall from the Egyptian sappers. One of these men is turning backwards and gesturing towards the woman with the hands over her heart. Maybe he is calling out to her to give news of what is happening, and she will take the message onwards to other soldiers or leaders. On the left side of this scene, we see another lady ushering children towards another hill, as if they too are going to a grotto or safe space to wait out the siege. So the artist painting Ka-em-heset's tomb has included a great deal of detail and life on both sides of the conflict. On the outside, the Egyptian soldiers are full of energy and vigor, scrambling up their ladder and hacking at the walls. On the inside, the locals are desperate and probably panicking, but they have the presence of mind to gather up their livestock and prepare for siege, to send the children to safety, and to listen for the attack on the walls and take messages throughout the town. It's a wonderful little scene that gives us an early taste of an ancient Egyptian siege. The tomb of Ka-em-heset, with its image of a siege, is a wonderful resource, but the next one is even better. Sometime around 2350 BCE, maybe a bit later, a man called Inti constructed his tomb at a place called Deshasha. In this tomb, Inti also depicted the Egyptian army in a siege, but this time he added far more detail than Ka-em-heset had done. Inti had a variety of titles that he used in his career. From the military perspective, his most noteworthy is Imira Menenu Nesut, or Overseer of Royal Fortresses. We're not sure where these fortresses were, but apparently Inti was in charge of multiple fortified centers. If I had to guess, I would suggest the fortresses were on the north or eastern border of the country, somewhere towards the eastern desert or the Sinai Peninsula. That's because the battle, which appears in Inti's tomb, seems to be taking place either in that eastern region or in southern Canaan. We can't assume the two are related, but it's a starting point, and it might give a hint at where these fortresses were. Anyway, Inti was in charge of royal fortresses somewhere. That gave him a degree of military authority, and apparently this also led to Inti participating in a campaign. This is where Inti's battle imagery comes to the fore. The scene appears on a wall of Inti's tomb. It is divided in two sections. On the right, we see a town. It is viewed from the top in a kind of oval, with a thick wall and bastions or towers around the edges. Slightly to the left, we have another image of Egyptian troops making an assault, with a tall ladder that they use to climb up the walls. So far, it's pretty similar to Ka-em-heset, but just past the soldiers with their ladder, we get another scene. This time, we have an entire field battle taking place outside of the walls, as the Egyptian soldiers attack their enemies in a brutal and bloody melee. This scene is full of amazing details. We'll start on the left with the field battle. The battle is divided into 4 horizontal layers or registers. At the top, we see a group of Egyptian archers. They are striding forward, at least 5 or 6 of them. They are holding their bows out ahead of them, and they seem to have quivers strapped to their backs. The archers are damaged and mostly lost, but we can tell that they used to have the white bands crossing their chest, the kind of leather or fabric armor, which might have been used to hold additional equipment. Just to the left of these archers, we see one of the enemies collapsing onto the ground. He is an Easterner by depiction. He has long hair, a long beard, and a white band tied around his forehead. This man seems to have gone up against the Egyptian archers. Unfortunately, he came away the worse. The man collapses to the ground, and he has 3 arrows protruding from his body. There is one in his shoulder, one in his forearm, maybe his bicep, and one in his face. The man seems to have an arrow sticking out of his eye, which on the one hand is an excellent shot, but 2 is a wound that is testified archaeologically. If you have listened to the most recent episode about the soldier's grave at Deir el-Bahri, one of the skeletons in that grave did have an arrow protruding from its eye. Coincidentally, another had an arrow protruding from his bicep, just like this Easterner collapsing to the ground. That is the top register. It's quite badly damaged and only a small section survives. Just below, on the second register, we see a full-on melee, as a group of Egyptian infantry square off with their enemies and grapple them in violent physical combat. It's a confusing, jumbled scene, but I'll do my best to unfold it. On the left, we see a pair of warriors. One is an Egyptian, who strides forward to strike his enemy, an Easterner. The enemy is collapsing to the ground, down on one knee, and the Egyptian soldier raises a foot to stand on his opponent's knee. The enemy, the Easterner, is raising both hands in a gesture of submission, a plea for mercy. Alas, the Egyptian is offering none, and he reaches forward with both hands to grip the handle of an axe. The Egyptian seems to be wielding a 2-handed axe. This is a weapon made of a wooden handle and a copper blade, usually in a half-moon shape. It's a powerful weapon with a great deal of striking force. The Egyptian, apparently, is bringing this axe down towards the head of his enemy. If he strikes true, he is quite likely to split the skull of his opponent, killing him in an instant. Ouch. Just behind this pair, another Easterner has collapsed to the ground, again with multiple arrows protruding from his body. It seems like we are getting the fight in the middle or later stages, as the archers have already loosed volleys at the foe, and the melee itself is winding towards the inevitable Egyptian victory. That is repeated in the next section. Again on the second register, just to the right of the man with the axe, we see another Easterner going down under the force of his opponents. This time, 2 Egyptian soldiers are pummeling this man to death. The Easterner, with his long hair and beard and a white ribbon around his head, is collapsing onto one knee and lifting his other foot up as if to ward off the Egyptian in front of him. Unfortunately, that Egyptian is striding forward with another 2-handed axe, and he is bringing that down towards his opponent. So the Easterner is facing death from the front. He is also about to receive it from the back. Just behind the defeated man, another Egyptian soldier is striding forward. This time, he has grabbed the Easterner by his head ribbon, or maybe his hair, and he seems to be physically restraining or pulling him backwards so that his comrade can strike with his axe. Meanwhile, this man clutching the hair is raising his own weapon, which could be another axe, but might also be a mace, and he is clearly in a pose ready to strike hard with his weapon, hitting the enemy on his body or head. It reminds me of that scene from the film Gladiator, in the very opening moments when the Roman army faces off against a barbarian tribe in Germania. There is a particularly distinctive moment in that scene where the tribal chieftain is facing off against Roman soldiers surrounding him. He is brutally effective and kills a few in the melee, but then several legionnaires gang up on him, stabbing him with their swords and pushing him to the ground. This scene in the tomb of Inti reminds me of that, an enemy who is fighting hard but being overwhelmed by multiple soldiers at once. It's brutal. The third layer or register is utter chaos. We have a complete mess of bodies tumbling over one another as different soldiers fall to the ground and others grapple and strike home with their weapons. To avoid overloading the detail, I'll provide a few snapshots. At the very heart of the scene, we see an Easterner leaning forward, and he is striking his foot against something. The man is reaching out with his foot and holding two ends of a bow. Apparently, he is breaking this bow in front of his enemy, in a gesture of submission, a way of saying, "Here, I am no longer armed, do not attack me anymore." There is a very good reason why the bowman is submitting. He has 5 arrows protruding from his body. There is one in his calf muscle, one in his knee, one in his upper arm, one in his eye, and one in his forehead. Hypothetically, he might have lived to be taken prisoner. If the wounds were shallow, just flesh wounds, an Egyptian physician could have treated all of those injuries. Unfortunately, as this man breaks his bow to surrender, an Egyptian warrior is striding forth, and he is striking down with another axe. The axe is just about to hit the Easterner in his shoulder, presumably to cleave deeply into his torso, or maybe horizontally through his neck. The scene is really quite harsh. Being struck with 5 arrows, giving up the fight and recognizing his defeat, the soldier is nonetheless slain as the Egyptian infantry surges forward in the attack. Honestly, I feel kinda bad for this guy. On the far left, we see another particularly brutal scene as 2 Egyptian soldiers are hacking at an Easterner. One is grabbing him by the hair and seems to be stabbing with a dagger. The other, behind him, is reaching out with both hands to wield his axe. He is clearly ready to strike the Easterner in the head or neck with the weapon. Between these 2 Egyptians, a second enemy has tumbled to the ground with an arrow in his arm and another in his heel, right in his Achilles tendon.
Again, it's like poetry, it's sort of they rhyme.
The very bottom register, the 4th, seems to show the aftermath of the battle. It includes the taking of prisoners. I suspect this scene is happening after the entire battle has finished, including the siege, so I'll come back to it in a moment. But very quickly, that is the extent of the field battle. Archers on the top, melee in the middle, prisoners at the bottom. Now, let's turn our attention to the siege. Moving to the right on the wall of Inti's tomb, we see the fortified eastern town. It is viewed from the top in a sort of oval shape, with a thick wall and semicircular bastions or towers around the edge. This style of depiction, an oval wall with the buttresses, is a common Egyptian motif to depict enemy towns, fortresses, or even entire kingdoms. If you visit an Egyptian temple, you will often see it at the base of statues, with hieroglyphs naming the city, and perhaps a human figure bound in captivity. Symbolically, these crenellated ovals with their prisoners identify the foreign peoples and lands whom the pharaoh claims to rule. The tomb of Inti uses that same motif, but probably in its original form, to depict a fortified town. Inside the walls, it is divided into 5 horizontal layers or registers. We'll discuss those in a moment, but first the exterior of the wall. On the outside, we see the Egyptian soldiers attacking the walls themselves. Unfortunately, this part of the scene is damaged, so we are missing a huge chunk of detail, but we have the basics. First, there is another ladder, which Egyptian soldiers have placed against the wall. At the bottom of the ladder, there is the small figure of an Egyptian soldier, who seems to be reinforcing the ladder, as if he is the one at the base, holding it steady for his comrades. Those comrades, presumably, surge up the ladder, climbing the rungs, wielding their weapons, and prepared to assault the town. Unfortunately, there is a large hole in the scene right here, so we cannot see the soldiers climbing. Presumably they were there, but we'll have to use our imagination. Just to the right of the ladder, between it and the city wall, we have another interesting detail. we see another party of sappers, just like the tomb of Ka-em-heset. This time we see two men holding long poles, possibly spears or a kind of hook-shaped weapon. They have driven them into the wall itself, and the artist has actually made the wall narrower where they are doing this. It seems that they are hacking or picking away at the bricks of the enemy town. Those bricks would almost certainly have been made from mud, so the ramming sticks or picks would have been quite effective if used repeatedly and with force. Curiously, the soldiers carrying these poles are actually facing away from the wall. They have driven the wood into the masonry, but now they turn and begin to march away. I almost wonder if these poles are supposed to have hooks on them, which we can't see because they're stuck in the wall, and they are trying to pull them out to force a gap in the bricks. Alternatively, perhaps the soldiers are pushing down on their poles, kind of like a lever, to move them about and weaken the mortar or masonry. We can only speculate based on the surviving portion of the image. But it's a curious thing that the Egyptian soldiers have rammed the wall and now turn away. I wonder what exactly they were doing. On the other side of the wall from the sappers, we see the locals responding to the attack. In the very bottom register, a local man is kneeling and placing his ear very close to the wall. He is clearly listening to the sounds of the Egyptian attack, trying to find the exact spot which they are assaulting, and predicting the exact moment when they are about to break through. Behind him, another man stands with both hands over his heart, as if he is panicking or ready to receive the message. Behind him, there is also a woman who seems ready to receive the message and take it to the town's leaders. That is the lowest of the 5 registers, and despite the evident fear of the individuals, it is the most straightforward section. The rest of the town seems to be in chaos. The artist decorating Inti's tomb has showed the local inhabitants of this fortified town in a spasm of fear and panic. They seem to rush about in a variety of confusing activities. It's a fascinating aspect of the decoration. To summarize it briefly, we see the locals tearing out their hair in desperation or bewailing the fate that is approaching them. At the very top of the town, on the right, we see another warrior breaking his bow as if he is ready to surrender to the Egyptian attack, and elsewhere we see individuals pulling at their hair in gestures of utmost fear and panic. That part of the tone is quite clear. But from there, things get slightly more complicated. Within the details of this scene, the personal interactions between members of the townsfolk, there is a great deal of confusion regarding the interpretation. It has to do with the locals and how they are interacting with one another. Throughout the town, we have a series of small vignettes that communicate the panic and fear of the locals. Sometimes it's relatively straightforward. In one section, the ruler of the city sits upon his throne while a family comes before him. The ruler is clearly in a moment of despair. He reaches up with one hand to touch the brow of his head, seemingly despairing at his predicament. The woman standing in front of him does the same, and she has brought her small child and an elderly male who leans forward on a walking stick. You could imagine that perhaps this family are pleading for assistance from the ruler, who himself is utterly lost at what to do. Scenes like that are relatively straightforward because they communicate a simple emotion. But sometimes it's not so simple. In the top register, we see an Eastern warrior kneeling on the ground. He is bending backwards, and he appears to have an arrow or dagger sticking out of his chest. A woman stands before the warrior, and she reaches out to clutch that dagger or arrow. Unfortunately, the conventions of Egyptian art make it unclear if she is pulling that weapon out to assist the warrior, or if she is pushing it in to attack him. Moments like these appear throughout the town. In one section, an Eastern warrior seems to be wielding his bow like a club, preparing to strike a pair of women before him. Or he may be reaching back, ready to throw his weapon away. An act of surrender before the town is taken. You can see the problem. The nature of ancient art can sometimes make particular actions or interactions difficult to read, so interpreting some scenes can be tricky. This is evident in the scholarship. There are three major discussions of this scene within Egyptological literature, and all three reach radically different conclusions about what the townsfolk are doing. In the 1890s, the archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who first described this tomb, interpreted the scenes of conflict within the town as a raid by Egyptian warriors. He saw the Eastern men as auxiliaries or mercenaries working for the Egyptian army. In his interpretation, they had swarmed over the walls using that ladder outside, and now they were attacking the townsfolk. But the townsfolk were fighting back and managing to get the best of them in some situations. That was one interpretation. A second and more curious one comes from the Egyptologist Ian Shaw. In 2019, he published a book called Ancient Egyptian Warfare, and Shaw interpreted this scene as a kind of civil war between the inhabitants of the town. In Shaw's interpretation, some of the Eastern warriors had fled from the battle outside, and coming back inside the walls, the townsfolk attacked these warriors for their cowardice. As you can see, those are two radically different interpretations from two different scholars. The third one comes from a pair of Egyptologists named Naguib Kanawati and Anne McFarlane, who in 1993 published a new study of this tomb and others in the necropolis. Their interpretation, I think, was the most straightforward. They saw the scenes of interaction between the townsfolk as people trying to assist their wounded and despairing warriors. In their interpretation, scenes like the woman grabbing the dagger or arrow in the man's chest were actually trying to help and heal their warriors. Overall, I suspect that Kanawati and McFarlane's interpretation, the locals helping their wounded comrades, is the most likely. For one, it's the most simple. It doesn't require us to invent Egyptian auxiliaries or mercenaries who have swarmed over the walls. For another, it matches with the overall tone of despair, which we might get from a raid or from the locals attacking their own people. But maybe it's simpler if the locals are simply afraid, both at their predicament and because some of their men have come back into the town with their own grievous wounds. It's not hard to imagine that if you were a family cowering within the walls, and one of your kinsfolk returned from the battle with an arrow sticking out of their chest, surely you would try to help them rather than castigate them for cowardice. Granted, that is purely interpretation, and a Western interpretation at that. But maybe one detail that clinches that interpretation is something that Kanawati and McFarlane observed, which both Petrie and Shaw did not. The 1993 analysis picked up on a small detail within two of these vignettes. Together, the authors described it as, quote, "The chieftain of the city and one woman tear their hair out in desperation. An old man, behind them, defecates out of fear, while another man does the same, presumably from the pain caused by an arrow in his buttocks." End quote. This is a small detail that can be quite hard to see depending on which picture or line drawing you're looking at. It is in the second layer, or register, from the top. The old man with his walking stick and another figure to the left both have a long stream of something coming out the back of their kilts. At a superficial glance on the stone, it might just look like damage, but if you look closely enough, you can see that it is actually small ovals, which the artist has meticulously carved with a sharp chisel. Notably, one of these lines of whatever actually goes behind the leg of an individual, so it is not accidental damage to the surface of the wall. Somebody has carved this intentionally. It does seem like both of these figures are kind of shitting themselves, which, if that isn't a mark of fear and panic, I don't know what is. The tomb of Inti includes a large, elaborate tableau. On the right, we see an enemy town surrounded by a thick wall, which the Egyptians are attacking with sapping sticks or poles and scaling with a tall ladder. Within the town, we find the locals panicking. Some of their warriors have returned with grievous injuries, and their friends or family are trying to assist them. The ruler of the town is beside himself with fear, while an old man just in front of him cannot control his bowels. A local archer breaks his bow in a gesture of submission, and at the bottom we see locals anxiously listening at the walls, waiting for that moment of the Egyptian breakthrough. Their fate, should such a breakthrough occur, can be seen outside the walls, where the field battle unfolds as a total Egyptian victory. The Eastern warriors are slaughtered by the volleys of arrows and the brutal melee assault. There is one last element to this scene, which I briefly mentioned earlier. Outside the walls, on the bottom register, we see the aftermath of the battle and siege. Here, Egyptian warriors are gathering up prisoners to take away as captives. We see a long train of prisoners walking away from the fortified city. There are at least 7 of these Easterners clustered together in 2 groups. On the left, we see a family, a man, woman, and a child, walking together. The family are marching away in bondage, literally. The man and the woman are tied together with a rope, and that rope leads to the hand of an Egyptian soldier who walks behind them carrying a long axe. The man at the very front is also bound at his hands, which are behind his back and tied together at the wrist. The child, it seems, is not bound, but the woman keeps her hand on his head, presumably to ensure obedience and to prevent any kind of reprisal. The child itself raises a hand above its own head, either to touch its mother on the arm or to gesture in a moment of despair. It's a dark scene. Behind this family, we see 3 individuals. They all appear to be men, and like the family before them, they are marching along with a rope tying together their waists. Again, that rope is held by an Egyptian soldier who marches behind them. That soldier appears to be multitasking. With one hand, he is holding the rope that ties the men together at their waist, and there is also an axe in that same hand. He is ready to do violence should any of these men try to escape. With his other hand, the Egyptian soldier is carrying something on his shoulder. What he has taken seems to be a woman. The Egyptian troop has a woman slung over one shoulder. He reaches out with one arm to grip her tightly and keep her balanced, and the woman drapes her own arm over the soldier's head, as if trying to keep from falling off. You could possibly read this as the soldier rescuing a wounded woman from the collapsing city, but in the circumstances it is more likely that he is taking her away as his personal prisoner and plunder. Again, like the family up the front, it's a dark scene when you get into the details. With that, the battle ends. Inti, commander of fortresses of the king, has achieved his great victory over this distant fortified village. We do not know where exactly it took place, possibly southern Canaan or in the vicinity of the Jordan River, or maybe somewhere closer to home. The scene is too damaged to provide the necessary details about the location or even the date. But what survives is, in many respects, a vibrant and dynamic image. An incredibly violent one, but a scene full of detail, which helps us to understand how the ancient Egyptians perceived and depicted these kinds of battles. How much does this reflect the true reality of what happened? We can't say for sure. Originally, there was a hieroglyph text describing the events within the town. Unfortunately, it is badly damaged and only a few words survive. From their 1993 publication, Kanawati and McFarlane could identify a few scattered words, including, quote, Wedjai, or I proceeded, Mesha en Sepat, the troops of the district, Sema, to kill or destroy, and Nedia, or Andia, possibly the name of the town. Finally, there seems to be a reference to receiving praise, or chesi, from the king himself. It is terribly fragmentary, you couldn't really use it to build a history or anything. But if those readings are correct, then maybe Inti described something along the lines of, quote, I proceeded with the troops of my district to destroy or kill the people or town of Andia. The king praised me on account of it, end quote. That is just a speculative reconstruction. Where is Andia? Unknown. Petrie, in 1894, thought it might be the town later called Amphia, just east of the Jordan River, but that was pure speculation based on the tiny fragment. The general area or location might fit, given that the town and its people seem to be Canaanite in their design. Unfortunately, that is the most we can say. It is happening somewhere in the general vicinity of the Sinai Peninsula or the lands of the southern Levant, Canaan and that region. What further details once existed in this scene? Only Inti knows for sure. The tomb of Inti at Dishasher and Ka-em-heset at Saqqara are the earliest full-scale battle scenes to survive from non-royal tombs. Alas, even these scenes are badly damaged and fragmentary. So, while they provide an invaluable resource for the developing art of war and siegecraft, the tombs of Ka-em-heset and Inti are probably only a small part of a much larger tale. Dramatic as these images are, they are only the beginning. Inti and Ka-em-heset decorated their tombs around 2300 BCE, approximately, and they are a rare example of such battles and sieges within tombs. Over the coming centuries, though, warfare would appear more and more often in the monuments of Egyptian people. To explore that, we must march onwards. Forwards in time, forwards into the fray. Between 2600 and 2200 BCE, the Egyptian army, quote-unquote, leaves a surprising variety of records. Sometimes the information is frustratingly scarce. How was a body of troops organized? How many were in a standard force? Did soldiers train specifically in different skills? Were there professional archers and professional infantry? Or did they overlap and change their gear depending on circumstance? Was there any kind of standing army, really? And if so, how big was it? All of these questions lack answers on the current evidence. But some smaller questions can be answered in surprising detail. What kind of equipment did the warriors use? Was there a bureaucracy or system of organization around military matters? Did the soldiers train in specific ways, with instructors helping them to hone their skills? Did the Egyptians practice siege warfare using specialized tools and tactics? These questions we can answer, and thanks to the ongoing efforts of archaeologists, new information regularly emerges from the sands for study and discussion. As always, our understanding of these topics is a work in progress. But overall, we can say at least one thing with confidence. During the Old Kingdom, between 2600 and 2200 BCE, Egyptian soldiers generally became skilled in the arts of war. Their weapons were effective, their training could be thorough, and they employed a variety of techniques to overwhelm their enemy. Describing their battles in art and hieroglyphs, their leaders took pride in conquest. Cities shattered, enemies prostrate in fear and despair, captives by the thousands, and the immortality of a victory well recorded. For some of these men, it must have seemed like the glory days would never, ever end. So how did it all go so wrong? Our stories today conclude just before the end of the Old Kingdom. But that's a curious word, end. How did the Old Kingdom disappear? What factors caused the downfall of the royal house? And in 2024, how do archaeologists and historians reconstruct these processes with new information? Next episode, we will explore those stories, and we will begin our tale of the First Intermediate Period. It's going to be a wild ride. I hope you enjoy. Before I go, I must make one quick thank you. No victory is achieved without divine blessing, and the gods do not bestow success without the proper offerings and prayers made by the priests. I would like to thank the priest-level supporters on Patreon, my top-tier subscribers who help me to pay for the research material I need to tell these stories in such detail. In May of 2024, the priests are Linda, Eric, TJ, Terry, Yola, Mycost, Andy and Chelsea, Evan, Kyla, Niden, Ashley, Veronica, James, and Arthur. Folks, thank you so much for your generous support. May the great divinities of Egypt and Canaan protect your city from any harm. May you enjoy an era of undisturbed peace, and may all your opponents cower at your strength. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon as we explore the collapse of the Old Kingdom.